समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
While you watch and follow very important deliberations of the Prime Minister's visit to Washington and his meeting with Donald Trump in his first presidency, another big diplomatic game is playing out on a global stage, on a much larger stage. Now, how do I explain this game to you? You remember the old line that what happens when two elephants fight? When two elephants fight, grass gets crushed. What happens when two elephants make love? Again, the grass gets crushed. That's precisely what's happening right now on the global stage. So you have Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin talking. They are talking. They had a 90-minute phone call. When was the last time you had a 90-minute phone call with anybody? Even if it was a very special somebody for you. We don't have those attention spans anymore. But this was a 90-minute phone call. I never thought Donald Trump was capable of staying focused for 90 minutes on something. But they had a 90-minute phone call, at the end of which Trump said that there was going to be negotiations leading to peace in Ukraine. At the same time, Putin said his own stuff, and Putin had set it up earlier on by flattery, usually which works with Donald Trump, but also some other moves. I will come to that. So these are the two elephants which are now sort of making love, or at least courting each other. In the process, what is the grass? It is Ukraine and Zelensky. So they are worried that they will get crushed in the process. So just after this phone call, Trump called Zelensky and had a call with him. Now, what is Zelensky's issue? His issue is a lot of his territory has been taken by the Russians. About 18% or about 111,000 square kilometers of his territory has been, this is about three times the territory of Aksai Chin, just for reference, that China occupies. Indian territory of Aksai Chin right up north, three times that much. So it is not small amount of territory that Russians have occupied, and all of it is territory in the flat land, in plains. This is very fertile land. Now, fertile land may or may not have that much value. Russia has enough fertile land, or enough land in any case, more land than anybody needs. What Russia needs, in fact, is people. If I were to digress for just 5 seconds, but come back to the point, Russia has that land. Russians would like this ceasefire or these lines to be frozen as they are, which means they keep about 1/5 of Ukraine. All of this they have not occupied in 3 years of this war. A lot of it they had occupied earlier. Crimea they had occupied in 2014. In fact, in just about 10 days will be the 11th anniversary of that occupation. After that, Donetsk, that is the region bordering Russia, and there the population, a lot of the population is Russian speaking. So Donetsk region, Russians have been occupying a lot of area and creeping into it much before the war began. In fact, if I take you back, that Malaysian airliner that was shot down by a surface-to-air missile in the hands of what were described as rebels in that region. Obviously, Russian armed rebels who were fighting to take these territories away from Ukraine. That airliner was shot down there. So a lot of that territory was in Russian control already. They've taken some more territory in this war. They've been denied bigger gains, and we know that they were expecting to take Kyiv on day 3 of the war. I'd also made the mistake in that first national interest where I said by the time you're reading this, the Russian tanks will be in Kyiv or maybe on the outskirts of Kyiv, but that didn't happen. That equation on the battlefield was reversed. However, the battle lines are mostly now frozen, with Russia controlling about 18% of Ukrainian territory. If you ask Putin, he will say Ukraine is not even a country. Ukraine doesn't have any right to exist. It was always Russia. It will be Russia. In fact, in one of his speeches earlier on, he had blamed Vladimir Lenin for having allowed this kind of Soviet Union to come in, where Ukraine also was a republic. His conception of Russia is the imperial Russia, which was pre-revolution and pre-Lenin. In fact, there is a quote from Sergei Lavrov, the long-serving foreign minister of Russia, who said, and it's a remarkable line, that Putin had listened before invading Ukraine. Putin had listened to 3 advisors: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. So you can see who controls Putin's mind. So he has an expansionist mind and he wants to keep this territory. Ukraine would want as much of it back as possible. Now see what's happened since then. While Putin made this move, Peter Hegseth, who's the new Secretary of Defense of the US, he is young by the standards of cabinet officers who hold that portfolio, even in the US. Although he said, I saw in Europe, when he arrived in Europe for the NATO summit, he said that in the morning I went for PT with troops, and you guys say that I'm young for Secretary of Defense, but for those guys I'm old, so I struggle with them, etc., etc. But I find that when he talks with a great deal of clarity. So he has now set out the agenda, or KRAs, key result areas, for American diplomacy in this case, in terms of what they want in Ukraine. He has said, first of all, that the notion that you could go back to the pre-2014 borders is illusionary. It's not going to happen. And this will unnecessarily prolong the war and cause more loss of life. Second, he says the idea that Ukraine could join NATO as a member is a non-starter. It's not going to happen. And the third thing he has said is that once there is a ceasefire, and now I'm using my own language, and the borders freeze where the rival forces are, to monitor that ceasefire and to ensure that there are no violations. These are all my words, not his words, but I'm explaining what he said. For that, there will be other forces. So obviously neutral forces. These forces, he said, could be European, from many European countries. He said they have to be capable forces, which I see as a little bit of a snide remark, because the American experience in Iraq and also particularly in Afghanistan tells you that European armies had fought very poorly, if at all they had fought very poorly, because Europeans have become very soft and European armed forces have become very soft. So these are really soft states, and that is what he's referring to. He wants capable European troops. Capable European troops, I would say, at this point will be the British and the French, and I don't know who else. But he also says, and also non-European troops. And Peter Hegseth also added that American troops will not be involved. We know that Trump has been making these promises that he wants American troops back into America. He doesn't want them anywhere, definitely not in conflict zones. He wants NATO countries, European countries, to take more responsibility. There's one more line that he used while at the NATO summit. He said there should be a strong NATO and a lethal NATO, but it should not be a diplomatic club. Right? That is also a very Trumpian view of NATO, that NATO countries must take responsibility for their own security. And Peter Hegseth also said that NATO countries must up their defense spending to 5% of their budgets. Right now it's about 2%, and that's also come to 2% after pressures from Donald Trump. Then he says that the European troops who will be there, they will not be covered by Article 5. What does he mean by Article 5? Article 5 is from the NATO Charter. It means that NATO forces, if they are attacked anywhere, then all other NATO countries and their forces will come to its defense. They will join the battle. If I take you back, there is a lot of debate in India, and now there is a lot of name calling. There is open season on Jawaharlal Nehru. There is a lot of name calling that Jawaharlal Nehru took so long to liberate Goa, that India became independent in 1947. The Portuguese had a very small detachment in Goa. Why did he wait 14 years to take Goa? This Article 5 is the problem there, because NATO had come into being before that, just after the Second World War. Portugal was a member of NATO, and what did the Portuguese do? Because they were so possessive about Goa, they said Goa is not a colony. They said Goa is part of Portuguese territory. So once they said it's part of Portuguese territory, then if India had taken forces into Goa, it would immediately trigger a NATO response, or at least there'd be pressure to trigger a NATO response. So now you can say Nehru was right or wrong, but the reason he waited this long was to build goodwill and equations in the Western world, basically in the NATO world, so they would accept that this was a colony and India could send its forces. This was taken almost overnight. It was called a big operation, but it wasn't really combat of any kind. So that is what explained the delay. It was Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That is what Peter Hegseth says will now not apply to European troops who might be there, in which case, how will it work? Probably it will require some kind of sanctifying by the UN. We all know that Donald Trump is not very respectful of the UN, but UN is an institution which is very useful in some situations. So is there going to be a control of that border by blue berets? If that happens, you can't rule out even Indian peacekeepers being there, but that is far in the future. Let's see what happens. So what's happening right now? And why did I say that there's a big geopolitical game on while Modi and Trump talk in Washington? That's because while these two elephants are making love or courting or whatever, a third elephant is stalking them. And that third elephant is China. Because this situation has fully upended the big power equations. I will read out to you a quote from Vladimir Putin. Now, first of all, Putin knows that flattery works with Trump. So as Trump won his election, Putin held his Russian Security Council meeting, which usually takes place on Fridays. In this case, he held it on Monday, January 20. That was the day of Trump's inauguration. Then he said, it is probably better for us to meet based on today's realities. What he's referring to is the ground situation, that he's got so much territory, today's realities, then talk calmly about all the areas that are of interest to both of us. It was part of Putin's flattery that he said at some point that Trump is right. I would not have invaded Ukraine if he was president, if he was in power. He also said at some point, again the same flattery, he admired Trump's courage in surviving 2 assassination attempts and still winning his election. He also said that Trump is right, that election was stolen away from him in 2020. That said, he added that he's open to negotiating the fate of Europe, right? Negotiating the fate of Europe, superpower to superpower, leader to leader. So what's happened in this case is that Vladimir Putin, under whom Russia has really weakened over the past decade, particularly since this war started. He is now again using his current situation, which is not leading anywhere. There is a stalemate on the ground. He is using this situation and Trump's urgency in bringing about peace to raise himself as in Russia, to superpowerdom. While this is going on, Trump playing the big superpower, but a peacemaker in this case. Putin trying to again project himself and his country as a superpower on a par with America. China obviously must be feeling out of it. So they are now stalking this situation. That's the third elephant. So the Chinese have already offered to broker a summit between Putin and Trump. That is an idea that the US has dismissed. In fact, there was a quote from White House. I saw in American media, anonymous quote that said this is an unworkable idea. It's not going to happen. But the Chinese want a piece of the action because over time, China has become a very close friend of Russia's. Russia has become very dependent on China, and see how it works. If there is peace in Ukraine, if this fighting stops, and if relationship between the US and Putin, and by implication between Putin and the West, improves, then sanctions on Russia will be loosened. As sanctions are loosened, as Putin has the breathing space, he's not that dependent on China anymore. So this becomes a three-way superpower rivalry. That is the reason I'll be persuaded to say that the entire superpower balance in the world has now been upended. Now see how Trump is operating. Trump is using both threat and the promise of what he can deliver. So what did he say about Russia? On January 20 itself, Trump said, I think he, as in Putin, I think he is destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia is kinda in big trouble. You take a look at their economy, you take a look at their inflation. And then he says, I got along with Putin great. I could hope he makes a deal. Now, Trump has always made deals like this. Remember, and the Chinese know it, that the first time in his first term, while he threatened to take trade action against China, he delayed it by an entire year because he was hoping to get China's help in making his deal with the North Koreans. So Trump is very transactional in that sense. That's the reason the Chinese have moved in to say, all right, you want peace in Ukraine. Putin's not listening. We are there. We lean on Putin. We can offer our good offices. That is something that Trump doesn't want right now. And he is trying to obviate that by doing it all directly by himself. Now, I gave you the quote from Trump where he's putting pressure on Russia. See then, what does he do to put pressure on Ukraine? He plays this game beautifully, I have to say. He said, for example, to Fox News, and I quote, Ukraine may make a deal or may not make a deal. They, as in Ukraine, they may be Russian someday, may not be Russian someday. So he's also brought in pressure on the Ukrainians that, listen, if you guys don't make this deal, don't count on me continuing to send all these supplies to you. My troops are in any case not coming there. So you know what is good for you, make peace. He's used the same kind of approach both for Russia and for Ukraine. And he's pushing both in the direction of peace. In fact, if you want to understand where Trump is coming from, see what Elon Musk is saying, because very often Elon Musk speaks as proxy for Donald Trump. So either he says something and Trump repeats it, or maybe he anticipates what Trump is going to say and he said it. So as part of his own Make America Great Again idea, Elon Musk is saying that America needs a ruler like Sulla. Now, Sulla was a ruler from about 138 BC to 78 BC in Rome. And Sulla then fought a big internal war where he killed tens of thousands of rivals, but at the same time established a really strong Roman Empire. And that is something that I find international commentators saying the rest of the world needs to worry about. An American president trying to make peace, we know that this is sort of counterfactual and this does not stand the test of history, but it is not as if he's doing it to win the Nobel Prize. He's making this also transactional because his point is so much of American money has been given to Ukraine to enable them to fight this war. America needs something in return. This has got a response from Zelensky as well. See what Zelensky is saying. He's been tweeting quite a bit, so I will not go over all the tweets, but some will run on your screen as I speak. Zelensky said, we are talking not only about security, but also about money, valuable natural resources where we can offer our partners possibilities that did not exist before to invest in them. For us, this will create jobs. For American companies, it will create profit. So the idea is that if Donald Trump wants critical minerals from Ukraine, his companies will come in. So he's in that case laying out his negotiating terms and also saying that he's open to making that deal, which is selling his critical minerals or his resources to buy American security guarantees. He would prefer, he says, American security guarantees because who would take Europe's security guarantees seriously anymore? Now, before I let you go, just a little bit of discussion on critical minerals. We've done full episodes of Karta Clutter about critical minerals and the Chinese domination of them. China is the world's largest possessor and producers of rare earths and minerals. What they don't possess in China, they've gone and acquired either by hook or by crook, some through BRI, some through lending, some through diplomatic methods, some through the usual superpower methods in Africa. So they control Africa, also Latin America. So they control a lot of critical minerals in the world. This also includes lithium, nickel, cobalt. These are all critical to the big economy projects right now. Electric vehicles, for example, mobile phones, electric vehicles, missiles, rockets, radars, electronic warfare systems. Besides the ones I mentioned, there is a whole bunch of other rare earth minerals. I once did a whole episode on them. I will share a link with you explaining what these are. Also, you will see some names running on your screen as we go along. Now, what does Ukraine have? I told you that I always thought that Ukraine mainly was a power that produced food grain and edible oil and some good planes. For example, AN-32s that we use, our Air Force uses. Antonov factory is in Ukraine. In fact, if you saw the latest Talbar class frigate that joined the Indian Navy, made in Russia, 2 have been made in Russia, 2 more will be made in India. These frigates run on engines that are made in Ukraine. So how does India swing it? So India buys these engines in Ukraine, then brings them all the way around to Russian ports. That's almost going halfway around the world. So these can be fitted onto these ships that Russia has manufactured. So Ukraine has engineering strength, but I never realized that they have such a wealth of critical minerals. Now, of the 34 minerals described by EU as critical, Ukraine has 22. That's a lot. Minerals accounted for 6.1% of Ukraine's GDP in 2021. For just comparison and for understanding, minerals account for about 2.3% of India's GDP. India is also making a mess of its mining, but that's besides the point. The fact is that Ukraine also is a mineral power, and that is when most of its critical minerals have not yet been mined. US Geological Survey, they list 50 minerals as critical, and these include nickel and lithium. 17 of these are metals that are critical to converting. I'm now oversimplifying it. Don't use it in a UPSC exam. And definitely, if you have a physics degree, don't laugh at me. But I'm oversimplifying it. There are 17 metals among these critical minerals which work on the magnets in such a way that they put power into motion for electric vehicles, cell phones, missiles, radars, electronic warfare systems, etc., etc., etc. You see Aero India is going on. You see stealth this and stealth that. All of that stealth would not be possible but for these metals. And then there are some other metals which are very, very critical. Titanium, for example. Titanium, lithium, large amounts exist in Ukraine. Lithium, a couple of the mines fall in the areas occupied by Russia, but lots of others still remain in Ukraine. So lithium, titanium, all of these are very important minerals. Now, if the American companies could come in, Zelensky is saying, all right, come in, this is my country, you do business, and obviously he will expect his royalties, etc., etc. So this will not be like Americans coming and taking a price for what they have given. But Trump will get something. Trump has to address his base so he can say, look, I got something in return for all that we have done for Ukraine. This is not one-sided love. Now, what is Trump trying to do? Read this article by Gideon Rahman in Financial Times. He says that the world right now, the world order is being upended because the world is dealing with 3 expansionist powers or 3 expansionist leaders. That is Xi Jinping, the usual suspect. He wants to take Taiwan, he wants to take Tawang and more, all of Arunachal Pradesh, right? He's an expansionist power because he wants to go back to some imperial map, his conception of some imperial map of China, so make China great again. Russia, Putin is the other expansionist power. Right now he's trying to take Ukraine, but he's got issues with Georgia beyond Ukraine. So it's Transnistria where he already has a foothold, and Moldova. So he sees that his own sphere of influence. Now that is one. The third one has now risen in Donald Trump. So Donald Trump one day says, I want Panama Canal. Second day he says, I want Greenland. Then he said, I want Gaza. Now initially it looked like it was all a joke. He was just putting everyone off balance. But then it doesn't seem like such a joke, because when he had this conversation with the Danish Prime Minister, he was quite rude with her because she offered him bases, she offered him anything that he wanted, but he just wanted sovereignty over Greenland. So you might say that Trump's method is to make maximalist demands and then settle for something. So the other side will say yes to something, like he did with Canada and Mexico. But we don't know. It looks like he does want to make America great again by taking more territories. And that is how these 3 countries are now they think that because each one is expansionist, and in this case, America is also territorially expansionist, each one wants to make their old country great again by taking territory from other countries. That pretty much suits China and Russia, because if America also goes that way, then it's every man for himself, or every superpower for itself. In that case, three spheres of influence will come up. So America has its sphere of influence in all of the Western Hemisphere. Russia has all of Eastern Europe, right? And China has East Asia. Talking about this division of zones of influence, Gideon Rahman also has a word of warning. He reminds us that in 19th century, the big powers tried to do the same thing, particularly with the scramble of Africa summits in Germany in the 1880s. Ultimately, it led them to two world wars in the following century, that is the 20th century. So what happens then for our region, the Indian subcontinent, or the region between East Asia and say the Indian subcontinent? I refuse to use South Asia, and then going on to West Asia, that's the Middle East. So the Americans would think that they will exercise influence in the Middle East. This will create very interesting possibilities and also some problems for swing power. Just until a few months back, we were waxing eloquent on the rising power of the swing powers. India was a swing power. In some way, France is also a swing power, but now they are all challenged. France has said, by the way, no, Ukraine should be a member of NATO. So France is looking for its own strategic autonomy. India has looked for its own strategic autonomy, but India will also worry that if China is allowed by the American power to have its own sphere of influence, what is to limit China to East Asia? What if the Chinese start looking to the west of China as well? In which case, it's the subcontinent where the Chinese would like to extend their influence, and they are already doing it. Pakistan is their vassal state. Bangladesh now is very vulnerable, and India's challenge in that case will become that much more formidable. In fact, looking at how the situation is unfolding, you would say that India made absolutely the right call, a very wise call, by not dumping Russia and by taking a very careful stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not condemning anything, not asking them to vacate any territory, just continuing on with that oft-quotable platitude, this is not the era of war.